Now let me introduce our speaker, Michael Lisicky. Michael has carved out perhaps one of the most fascinating niches of historical expertise that I have ever heard of. He is a nationally recognized expert on the history of our grand department stores, those iconic emporiums that we all remember from our youth and from not too many years ago. Regardless of where you grew up, many of us remember fondly childhood outings to our downtown department stores with our parents or our grandparents to shop for new school shoes or for a new holiday outfit. Sometimes these excursions included lunch at the store's tea room or restaurant. And of course, we remember downtown shopping trips for ourselves, and perhaps with friends or with our own children or grandchildren. Well, Michael has written 11 books on the history of some of the best-known American department stores, including Gimbels, Abraham & Straus, Wanamakers, Filene's, and Bamberger's, among others. His books have been critically acclaimed as affectionate histories of these establishments that once ruled the retail landscape in our major cities. Today he will talk about Washington's most iconic department stores, and primarily about Woody's, a store that I would venture every person in this room has patronized. Michael is a sought-after speaker and has lectured widely on his unique historic specialty. He's been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune magazine, Bloomberg Business Week, on National Public Radio, and on the CBS morning television show, Sunday morning television show. When he is not researching department store histories, the multi-talented Michael has an equally fascinating day job as an oboist with the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. He is a graduate of the New England Conservatory and was a member of the Savannah Symphony and the Richmond Symphony before joining the Baltimore Symphony in 2003. So please join me in welcoming Michael Lisicky.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mary, and thank you everybody here in Chevy Chase that brought me down here to talk once again and probably about one of my favorite topics, and I hope I live up to the hype. Man, that is a build-up here. But I have to say, coming down from Baltimore, since this is from Chevy Chase Historical Society, I was sad to see the Chevy Chase supermarket gone. That's just a little note I'm going to start off with, because that's all part of the identity and part of the reasons that got me involved with one of the things you see up there. Yes, by the time I wrote a book on Woodward and Lothrop, that was 6 books into my whole process, into what happened to me. This is my identity. I am that. I am an oboist in the Baltimore Symphony. What am I doing? I'm not from Washington. I never worked in a store. I never did retail. Why am I standing in front of everybody here right now talking about this? And right now, because we love coming down Montgomery County. We have the concerts up in Strathmore, and probably about now we'd be getting ready to start Copeland's Third Symphony. But right now I'm kind of on a little rest as I rework my fingertip from an injury. So that makes it even easier for me to come down and talk about what I did with these, as you heard. I never wanted to write a book. I never did. I never intended to. And I always kept this whole thing, this whole passion, this whole interest of department stores to myself. You had to kind of know me in order to know anything about this, because I don't understand it. I don't really understand why I got wired to like these places. I mean, there's reasons for it. I mean, there's things that I don't know why you like colors, why you like flavors, restaurants, and you try to explain it, and there doesn't necessarily have to be an answer, but for some reason I got to like these, and I'm not even a shopper. I am happy to say that if you go through government records, I was born in 1964. That's the final year of the baby boomer generation. I'm proud of that. Maybe I'm just too old school with that. But one of the reasons with the baby boomer generation, and I grew up in New Jersey, was that by being involved in that era, I got to experience these, and I also got to see them disappear. And that kind of made me scratch my head, because I think there's a lot of people in this room, and I know it, that expected these places to be here, that took for granted. They expected that this was always going to be here, whether you went there or not. They had to be here because you grew up with them. Generations of you all either worked there or shopped there. They just played such a role. They played such a role in our identities, who we are. And that comes especially to play here in the Washington area. Yes, I grew up in Philadelphia area, and we had plenty of stores there. Come on, I got with Strawbridge and Clothier, John Wanamaker, Gimbels. Oh man, talk about Gimbels in a second, but in New Jersey, in Philadelphia, what is interesting in the Northeast is you can drive a half hour and go somewhere else. And that means going to a city, large, small. You could go an hour, you can even get to bigger cities. Go to an hour and a half. That's what got my mother, who loved to get in a car, a station wagon, throw her kids in there and go for car trips. And what she knew were department stores. Her first job was at Strawbridge and Clothier in Philadelphia, worked in candy, and then went to gift wrap, sang in the chorus before she went on to other things. But that's what she knew. So when we went to these cities, Washington became a little bit farther for us for day trips. But that was what we centered our trips around. And that started to pique my interest. So what is this all getting at? Because we didn't buy, we weren't shopping, we weren't going to sales. I realized, it took me probably 3 books to realize that this was, all of you talk about, like, especially with women and all, getting in the streetcars and going downtown and getting in your gloves and going to the tea rooms and stuff, and this was your social time. Many of you had your social time with grandparents, parents, whatever, in streetcars, going to these places. My streetcar was a station wagon, and that's part of being the end of the baby boomer generation. And what I loved about these places was that this was the time I was spending with my mom. She was also the type of person that went grocery shopping every day, and she would ask me what store we wanted to go to. I got to choose. Why? I got to spend time with my mom, and she liked to go in the car. It was a fun way to grow up. And that's why I loved how every city, how every place had its own identity, their own names. Everybody seemed different, and it was cool. It was okay. And as I said, I saw some of these places starting to go away. You kind of turned the other way. Things happen, whatever. But it was 1986. When they announced, British American Tobacco said that unless we find a buyer immediately, we are going to close Gimbels. Gimbels is going to go away. Yeah, Gimbels. This ain't going to go away. It's Miracle on 34th Street. Macy's versus Gimbels. Nobody undersells Gimbels. Gimbels was part of our culture. Gimbels went away in June 1986, and that rocked my world. It really kind of did, because I didn't expect them to go away. Was I shopping there? No. Did I expect it to be there? Yeah. And I was even way. I was doing Aspen Music Festival, and I'm having my brother taking pictures of Gimbels all around the Philadelphia area so I could just put them in a photo album and close the book and not share that little obsession, passion, whatever, with anybody. And I also needed to know more about these stories, more about the stories of the stores. And it's kind of fun at that point, before the internet, not being too far from the Library of Congress, and with a little bit of patience and time in the microfilm reading room, you can find out a lot of stuff that other people don't know. And as the web starts to come into play, you realize you're not alone. And that became fun. That's where I became an expert. And you don't have to get a degree in being an expert, as long as you know what you're talking about. And initially, when I was approached to do a talk, it's like we'd talk about like the American department stores or whatnot, and we'll be here for days. We'll be here for days. And I ended up, after years and years of collecting and reading, especially newspapers, I ended up with the nation's largest newspaper archive on department stores in the second floor of my house in Baltimore, which is just for me. And what I like to do It's like, here I am, an expert. People contact me all around. I'm an oboist, but I'm also an expert now. And people have started to ask questions because they came across this site called departmentstorehistory.net that I started writing into. It's like a Dear Abby, the secret society, people wanting to know history questions. And I had it in the next room. And that's where I became deemed an expert. I had these answers. And I don't just limit my information to what I know. I kind of know what's going on around the country. Give me a city. Who wants to give me a city? And that you know. And let me tell you, because this usually comes in handy. When you're a musician, when you're in an orchestra, sometimes you're put in these social situations where you don't know what to say to people. And these are people that you want to be nice to, especially. And what do you say to somebody? Where are you from? And you tell them the store in their city, and they say, how do you know that? And it's usually kind of, you don't really know what to say. Now I can say it to all you. Give me a city. Who is a city? Wait, what? Los Angeles. Well, you have so much to go with, but okay, you can do Bullock's or Bullock's World. Sure, you got May Company. I love the May Company that was on Broadway before it went out. May Company had a wonderful store on Wilshire Boulevard as well. Robinson's. I love Robinson's, J.W. Robinson's with Associated Dry Goods. And we talked about Bullock's, the Broadway, Carter Holy Hale. Carter Holy Hale started to feed into some of the Woodward and Lothrop aspects, especially in the mid-'80s. Give me some more. Oh, Bakersfield. Oh, man, there is something out there. Because I always get it confused with Fresno a little bit with Goshaw's. Bakersfield, is it Harris? What is it? Oh, you got to know. What is it? Mervyn's. Well, Mervyn's is out of Hayward, California. But, yeah, there is something in Bakersfield. All right, give me. Detroit. Oh, Detroit. If I could get one of those little pills and go back to 1953 in Detroit, would I love walking around Hudson's? But that's not the only thing. We could also mention Crowley Milner. We could talk about Kearns. You could talk about Federals, which played a whole different role, even though the owner started torching the stores in the late 70s in order to get insurance money. But Hudson's, that was a city upon itself, and Detroit was really kind of a one-city store to that degree. Hartford. Is there anything more wonderful than Beatrice Fox Arbach with G. Fox, who is so powerful and one of the real revolutionary women in retailing that she even worked to configure the interstate system around downtown so that it would empty out into the G. Fox garage? Not that it's the best system, but she was able to have that kind of pull. She was such a merchant, but don't forget about Y. Smith and Sage Allen. I always like Sage Allen a little bit because it was just catered to a type. Two more, yeah. What? Yeah. Which one? Kansas City. Well, okay. Harsfels at one point was part of the whole with Garfinckels as they played in there, though it was more of a specialty store. But R.H. Macy took over Taylor's in 1949, maybe, or 45, and became a real Macy's division up until 1984 when they sold it to Dillard's. But Jones Store always defined Kansas City to me. But they still have halls there, part of the Hallmark family, which still operates at Crown Center. One more. Cincinnati's kind of fun. And because, before Shillito's then became with Lazarus, I liked McAlpin's. You had Pogue's, which was part of the whole complex there at Fountain Square. What was one? Mabley and Carew was there in 77 until they sold it to Elder Bierman, until then they got it. See, I can talk ad nauseum of this stuff. And we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about this. And first of all, go ahead a little bit more. Oh, all right, let me just go through my little roll. Because remember, I'm an oboist. I'm an expert now, but I'm an oboist. But there I am talking for the Maryland Attorney General's lunch in 2015 about customer guarantee. What am I doing? I'm an oboist. There I am talking at New York Fashion Week about the history of how department stores grew in Manhattan. Tim Gunn, a Washingtonian himself, did the foreword to this book. There I am on CBS Sunday morning outside the house while they came and spent the day with me talking about J.C. Penney with that little decision they had there a few years ago that made it not pennies anymore. This is wonderful. Oh, gosh, we could have a whole talk about Sears. What is that about? There I am on BBC World News America just this past spring, where they called up and they wanted to do a report on Sears that would air around the world, that would be where people could understand in different countries what Sears was, because Sears was something. And where do you want to meet? Why don't we go to the store in White Oak there on New Hampshire Avenue? That was great. We met in the parking lot. What a store that was in 1966 when that opened with 60,000 people invited. And who was the store interior designer that gave the influence was Letitia Baldridge. I mean, Jackie Kennedy's assistant. You had Vincent Price also did some of the treasures collection that they had in the basement as well. And when it opened up, they had some kind of, I don't understand it, a computer influenced electric arc that burned the ribbon for the opening day. Sears, wow, it was something. That store is still there. I love going in it, and it was all the more reason to go have this report given at that store. Woodward and Lothrop. Let's talk about Woodward and Lothrop. This might be the part where I have to take my glasses off because I do want to go through some of the historical details. I love research. I love doing research. Why, I don't know. I just love learning these stories, and I like trying to convey these stories. But I will say it took me a long time to get used to calling this place Woody's. Because with nicknames, are they insulting or are they endearing? What other store? The only other store I could think in this country that really operated under a comfortable nickname other than Woody's was Bloomingdale's. All the others, they'll take maybe you'll just put the apostrophe S on the main name, like what Hecht Company did with Hecht's. But to change it and to alter it like that, I thought was blasphemous for the long time. I'm old school. It was Woodward and Lothrop, and it was the Hecht Company. And I know how to spell Garfinckels correctly, by the way, too. But I realized it is endearing to use a nickname. And it was 1949 when it was the first time I saw the term Woody's used in relation to the business. It was part of a children's radio show that they have. Woody and Lodi were the two main characters. So I learned it's okay to call the place Woody's. When you write these books, you don't have control over the title. That's what the publisher does. And whether you like it or not, that's what you're stuck with. But how could you not find a better byline than a store worthy of the nation's capital? And I want to talk about that briefly, because do not get upset, but there is this feeling outside the Washington metropolitan area that there might not be such thing as a Washingtonian, believe it or not. So, after writing the book, starting off in 2009 with Hutzler's in Baltimore, which was really Woodward and Lothrop down here. Same buying office, different family, different store. That book in 2009, when I wrote it, was just kind of a pet project just to see, because I didn't think anybody remembered these places or cared. Look, we got a whole full house here. And I didn't know that I was going to outsell Danielle Steele for 2 weeks before Christmas 2009. I blew Mark Twain away, and it was the top book on Maryland history for 8 months, I think. I mean, it was just insane. And then as I went through the next 4 books, every once in a while I would get a question where someone would say, why don't you write a book about Woodward and Lothrop or Woody's? I accepted it. But I was like, I don't know. It's is there such thing as a Washingtonian? And finally, after hearing that request, I decided, let's take this on. And one of the Woodward and Lothrop, the collection, much of the historical, the board minutes, marketing, is kept at the DC Historical Society downtown Mount Vernon. And that is a great resource. to have that stored there. And when I first went there to do some of the research, because they did contribute to the book with some of those images and all, in addition to the DC Public Library, there was twice when people heard, Woodward and Lothrop, you're doing a book on Woodward and Lothrop, you're doing a book on Woodward and Lothrop, and I realized something was there. And when the Woodward and Lothrop book came out, I'll call it Woody's, in 2013, what you do is you immediately start setting up lectures because you want to promote it and all that stuff. My first lecture was at the DC Public Library downtown. And there to give the lecture, it was like in November 2013. Here we are downtown where I want to be. And we have this conversation, much that I am having with you right now. But it's in a real downtown audience. And I talked about, is there such thing as a Washingtonian? And we decided, after having an open discussion, that you have to, well, how about the Beltway? Using that as a guideline to say whether you really can qualify. I mean, it was just kind of this fun conversation until this woman stood up in the back, threw some books on the floor and said, you had to be born and reside within the district limits. And then ran out, like not ran out the door, but stormed out the door. You could be scared when that happens, or you could be fascinated, because here is a person that proved to me in 1 second, 3 seconds of outburst, that there is such thing as a Washingtonian. And it was just, it's wonderful to know that. So, a store worthy of a nation's capital. Okay, of course, they're not Washingtonians that founded Woodward Lothrop. Here are the founders of it. Samuel Walter Woodward. Sometimes he likes to be called Samuel. Sometimes he likes to be called Walter. Sometimes he likes to be called SW. And trying to get that consistent in a book can be maddening a little bit, along with a partner, Alvin Mason Lothrop. Both of them are from New England. We had him, Woodward was from Acton, Massachusetts, and Lothrop was from Damariscotta, Maine. And they were the two men behind the business. But they got their start up in Boston in 1870 when they joined Kushner and Ames, which is a dry goods store up in downtown Boston. And that is the era of haggling. No prices, selling merchandise that may not be going, inconsistent from buyer to buyer. They became friends, didn't like that whole business practice, which was kind of the custom. And they left in 1873 to buy Billy's Button Shop in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and learned how to operate that business, turned it into a dry goods store, kept it there. It's across the river from downtown, so they had their own audience there, but they realized their future was not going to stay put in Chelsea, Massachusetts. So then they went through, Walter, call him Walter, went on a train ride. His goal was to find a place where to move the business. And they were so used to that whole Boston scene. They went to Baltimore, looked at Baltimore, thought that it seemed like Boston, went to Kansas City, went to Omaha looking for that territory, and went to, the relatively young city of DC. And saw the potential there. And then there's that quote that you see in corporate stuff for Woody's everywhere, Alvin, this is the place for us. And that's where they moved. And here's the opening announcement. They opened, just to get the exact correct date so I can have it for you, was February 25th, 1880, where they founded the Boston Dry Goods House. And here's out on Market Place, where they called it, right there in downtown DC. Couple of the interesting things they did, they used the same practice that they got comfortable with in the Boston area, was that whole one price. One price house. I love going through things here, and then you get to the bottom with Woodward, Lothrop, and Cochran. So of course I'm going to spend the next few nights wondering who Cochran is. We know Woodward and Lothrop. Who's Cochran? Well, Charles Cochran is somebody that became a partner in the business, and they needed him to help bring the capital in. He decided he could do it himself a few months later and left the business and started his own on the other side of town. And I have no record of it 7 months after he opened it in 1880. They defined this store from the very start in probably the best way possible, which was that they were going to have the better merchandise at the better selection with the better service. I got to see Woodward and Lothrop, as I concentrate on it, as the better store. You have different levels here. I thought I was just a genius when I decided to look at Woody's, when you look at it in the context here in the DC market, as a car, let's call it an Oldsmobile. It's better than you don't need an Oldsmobile. You could have gone away with a Chevy. What's a Chevy? Could that be Hecht's? If you want a Cadillac, that could be Garfinckels. So the whole concept from the beginning that they wanted to do there with Woodward Lothrop was kind of be the better store. And when you go shopping, whether it was back here in 1880 in a more modest way, or even let's go into the 60s and 70s, was you wanted to go someplace that was a little higher up than what you were accustomed to, for you to find that deal, for you to find that piece of merchandise. And that kind of played their role for many years. They did move to the outskirts, the Hicks. They're at 11th and F. They're in 1887 in this building called the Carlisle Building. And they kept growing there along F Street, and acquiring different properties, St. Vincent's Orphan Asylum being one, and just kind of going down the block. Many department stores, many as they were building, kind of did grow it in piecemeal. Here we go, because there were so many different renovations and additions, though you wouldn't realize it because that's kind of how you see it. That's a picture of it from 1995, of kind of adding everything together. They had major additions in 1912, 1925, and 1926. It's hard to pinpoint when the formal opening of that store was, but they did that whole neoclassical design and have a uniform look to it, that classic department store. And then we have that entrance there on G Street with that wonderful ornate terracotta there. The main floor. It was such a quintessential main floor. The upper floors, when you go through it, are much more modest in design. But even as somebody at the time, you've heard, if you were listening before, I was in the Richmond Symphony. And I don't know, does anyone know Richmond? Does anyone know Tallheimers? Does anyone know that I was the final shopper at Tallheimers? After 149 years, I waited, I was on the upper floors. I had a friend, a bassoonist in New York, who said, you gotta be final shopper. We were there for the last day. I was like, I don't wanna be final shopper. You gotta be the final shopper. And we worked our way down as the registers closed. And I just pulled something off a rack because there wasn't much to buy. And then the news stopped me on the way out because I was the final shopper. And my big quote in the paper in 1992 was, he bought a woman's shirt. And my answer was, they didn't have any men's stuff left. And why I mentioned Tallheimers, because that was a real loss at the time when I was in Richmond. A loss to that identity, a real kick in the gut to downtown. And for me to fill that void, I would go here. I would go to Woody's in downtown DC to get that kind of feeling. It only lasted for about 4 more years. But okay, yeah, let's all go with the tea room. There's a reason why there's tea rooms. There's a reason why there's toy departments on the upper floors. Why do you have to drag your parents all the way through the store? Why? But there's a reason why you're going all the way through the store, by the way. And the tea room, once you get the customer in the store, you don't want them to leave. You got to get them off the street, get them in there, and don't let them go. That's where the service was. That's where everything. Just keep them in the store. These weren't necessarily profitable places for the business. This is on the 7th floor there at Woody's, but it kept people there and it kept the social component alive. What I always found fascinating with Woodward and Lothrop, this is a series of postcards, you can even find them on eBay, they show up pretty regularly, was that 1/2 of the business of Woodward and Lothrop, which is unlike any other store, I feel, that operated in this country, was home furnishings. You had that huge building. 1/2 of that building was all associated with home, and they were really known for that, even into its later years. In 1937, they developed that really special relationship with Colonial Williamsburg that just continued and continued with part of their image. And that is something I feel that really helped give it that better image and really set it apart, especially with the other competitors that you have down here. So yes, so there's that wonderful main store. You see how you have the different sections of it, but you don't really know it because they did try to do, to try to make it a little bit more homogenized there. Does anyone know what that is? That was behind it. That's Palais Royale. The first department store built from the ground up. It was founded by Andrew Listner, who we have there at the Listner Auditorium at George Washington University, probably one of the biggest benefactors and wealthiest citizens that became here in that lived in the DC area. He operated this store, Palais Royale. He was drawn there. It's right behind the G Street entrance of Woody's, and built there in 1893, kind of drawn there because of the success that Woodward and Lothrop was having. Listner retired from this business in 1924 and then sold it to Sebastian S. Kresge, not to operate it as a variety store, but to operate it as a downtown department store, a traditional department store. He did the same thing with the store in Newark. And it was very successful. You have here what I loved. I mean, it was kind of it didn't really have a full identity, even though it kind of complemented Woody's to some degree. But one of the things they had for 6 years that I found from 1936 to 1942 was Kris Kringle. Cute Kris Kringle. And if you looked in a certain area, you would see a 3-inch tall Santa that would be dancing around. And you would go as part of because this is all entertainment. We have to have entertainment. That also is part of the job that these stores had. And that was in contrast to the 375-pound Santa that they used with the size 60 waist pants. So you had this kind of part of this humorous kind of way to bring the kids in. And when there was rumor in 1946 that Palais Royale, that Kresge wanted out, there was a rumor that they were going to sell it to Macy's. Woodward and Lothrop did not want Macy's back in 1946 across G Street from it. So they purchased it. It became the North Building. If anybody was familiar with Woodward and Lothrop, the North Building, that was Palais Royale. What did Palais Royale, other than giving the opportunity of keeping the competition away? They had these branch stores that were open. Here is the Bethesda Budget Store at 7301 Wisconsin Avenue, helping serve the far-out residents of Bethesda. You can come. I don't know why they only operated as a budget store. But after this opened in 1942, had a disastrous fire. Woodward and Lothrop rebuilt it there, added a second floor in 1952. That same Georgian that Georgian style there that we see in other stores that they build later on. They also had Palais Royale, which Woodward Lothrop took over, was a store in the Pentagon. They had a little store in the Pentagon, and what was set them out is that you had to be a federal government employee to work in that business to have the clearance. But there we are in 1957, excuse me, the two grandsons of Woodward and Lothrop. There they are on the main floor. And just so I don't want to really misspeak any of their names out of respect. You have Andrew Parker on the left, who is the grandson of Woodward, and then you have Lothrop Luttrell, which is on the right. The two men really were very different. Parker was involved in the whole merchant side, running the store, being the community spokesperson, and Luttrell was the one that really did the nuts and bolts with the financing to see where the future of the business was going to be. And here we go. Took 5 years of design, of planning to build, I would say, their second most successful branch store during the course of its history. There you go. In November 1st, I believe, 1950, you had this wonderful store that they opened here in Chevy Chase at the corner of Wisconsin and Western Avenue, in that classic design that you will see of many of the Woodward and Lothrop branch stores. A wonderful store that was a little too small, but really was such a signature piece. It catered to not just the area residents here. It was catering also to people within the city limits and also from Northern Virginia who wanted to come and shop there. 5 years in the planning, 1945 until 1950 it took before, who does that anymore to take that long to plan these stores out? I love the fact that the first shopper at the Chevy Chase location that they invited was the first shopper at the store they opened in 1880 with a 94-year-old, what is her name? It is in here. Margaret Welsh out of Rockville. was the very first shopper in D.C. The first shopper out here in Chevy Chase as well. 100,000 square feet for that building is not huge for a department store, but it really did serve a huge void that was out here in this area. There are loads of places. I love time capsules. And one of these days, I want to see one opened. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if the Chevy Chase Historical Society knows anything about that time capsule that was located at that store. But in it was a capsule of Earth from the groundbreaking, a copy of Woodlothian magazine, which is the employee magazine, which I assume there are probably some old Woodlothian employees that are here. They had corn kernels in there, which symbolized growth, and also news clippings. Very successful. Just a little too small. Couldn't grow. But they also operated some stores in Alexandria. You have Seven Corners, if you remember Seven Corners, which I love finding the facts that it was the nation's first shopping center when it opened in 1956 to have 2 department stores. No other center in the country had that. Indoor malls were not quite fostered yet, but to have a shopping center with 2 department stores, you had Woodward Lothrop and you had Garfinckels at the other ends. And you also had the world's largest digital clock outside that said what time the temperature was, and the lights went up if the temperature was going up, and the lights went down when the temperature was going down. Now, when you also look at Woody's historically, here you are in February 1880. What other store in D.C. is advertising bathing suits in the display window? There was something about displays which really also set that store apart. And you can even look at the man that was responsible for it, George Payne, who was educated at Yale, in the theater department, who was in charge of many of these especially the windows. There we go. We go back to Williamsburg. In 1966, they had this whole famous display of Williamsburg scenes. He worked at that store from 1958 to 1970, setting it apart. As we looked at that tea room before, when you go up there for socially, you got to get the customer in the store, and what better way to do it than to have them stop at your display window and to have them stare. And then you got to get that person in. And what better way to do it but would be, whether it's some of the Christmas windows here, or else doing partnerships with the zoo, having penguins in the window. All of that is entertainment. All of that is entertainment. Entertain everybody and get them upstairs. Wheaton. Wheaton was a very important store for the company, and not far from you guys out here in Chevy Chase as well. It was larger than the Chevy Chase store, but it was a little bit down market, let's say, than what they were carrying in Chevy Chase. They had a little higher ends in Chevy Chase, but you had a bigger location here. Wheaton Plaza opened in 1960. It was the largest shopping center in the D.C. area for, I think it was up until Tysons opened in 1968, where you had Wards, you had a Giant there, and we can talk about Hot Chops. I still make their chicken noodle soup, and they have that cookbook. If you like Hot Chops, get that cookbook and start doing some things out of there. They also operated the first full-line department store in Annapolis. This is at Parole Plaza there in 1964. Eastover. Why I bring this up, which was originally a budget store, is that Woodward and Lothrop, a lot of people like to stay away from Prince George's County. That's the way it is. They don't like to invest there. It still becomes a hotbed of topics there. Say what you want, but for some reason, Woody's did invest there with this store in Eastover. You had the Prince George's Plaza, of course. That's not far from the university, and also Iverson Mall there. They seem to have a commitment, and later on adding that important location, which everybody went to at Landover, which served the purpose for a time. Okay, Tysons Corner. The Tysons Corner International Shopping Center, which was its first name, 1968. It took a little bit of convincing to get a mall with 3 anchors built. And when they made the presentation for the funding, the 3 stores they named were Woodward and Lothrop, Hecht Company, and Landsberg's. Talk about Landsberg's in a second. That's a fascinating one for me. So when they got the approval, they said, no Landsberg's. we're going to replace it with something else. And it became this big hotbed. This because Landsberg's was a store that wasn't exactly what they were hoping to get for in Tysons Corner, but they needed to use that name in order to get the backing, the go-ahead to build this plaza. This is where they say the magic happened. This is where you went to try out things. This is where you invested, where you had wanted to try a different type of merchandise. You did it at Tysons Corner. It was the only higher performing sales per square foot store that Woodward Lothrop had other than the Chevy Chase store. Okay, now I did want to talk about the other stores, obviously, here. And, and I thought, here you are in Chevy Chase. Should we be talking about the other stores that were here in Chevy Chase? I mean, this is going to go on for hours, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to talk about the Lord & Taylor that opened here in Chevy Chase in November 1959 with that birdcage restaurant, and the fact that the company felt they had a patriotic obligation to operate a store in the nation's capital. I'm not going to talk about the Saks Fifth Avenue store that opened in 1964 that was really modeled after Marie Antoinette's chateau outside of Paris. I'm not going to talk about in 1977 where Neiman Marcus finally opened up its store at the Mazda Gallery after all the construction delays because the rock was too hard to blast away, and the fact that the subway was coming in there and kind of creating a mess and stuff. Never quite happy with that. So I'm not going to get into any of that. But I will talk about Garfinckels, because a lot of people love Garfinckels, which is, if you were to do another book in the Washington area, Garfinckels certainly would serve a purpose. And as we go back to that car, it is that Cadillac. I like this one definition that people gave as far as what Garfinckels was. It was the what is the terms they use here? Excuse me, as my eyes just kind of fade a little bit here. Because I do like it had dim lighting, no escalators, no sale signs, but grace, beauty, and dignity. Yes. And it's true. They didn't have escalators. When you go in there, especially as a kid growing up in the whole suburban mall area, you wonder how you're going to get upstairs. But the whole role of the elevator operator. But let's look at that, and I'll bring it up again later, is how the department stores weren't exactly diverse workplaces. So, and that played into the role, especially as we get into all what happens in the 60s and many of the social changes that were coming to be. But people just having that relationship with elevator operators, do not say anything you don't want repeated to your boss in an elevator if you have a nice relationship. Things can go around. So, but people had they were friends. They helped bring, there was another reason to bring people in there. Garfinckels, there's kind of that dim lighting and no sale signs. It was a different place. It was one of these places too, as when stuff is opening around here in the DC area, especially as you go up Wisconsin, you always wanted this here, but you were trying other places out. You had this fondness for Garfinckels with the restaurant, especially down there at the DC store. They had a number of locations. Oh, there's Spring Valley, the first branch store of any of the department stores in DC to open up there. They never called it a branch store. They called it a replica of the downtown store. But they had places around here. Of course, it was the F Street store that really defined it. But when you trade up and have higher end merchandise, you limit your customer base that you can attract to. And especially when you start gearing and looking at other places that are kind of piquing your curiosity, Garfinckels just became a victim of itself. But it was nonetheless just played such an amazing role down here. Hecht Company. I never got comfortable calling it Hecht's. It just felt like I was coughing when I'd say it. And I'm old school. It's the Hecht Company, just as it's Woodward and Lothrop. And I know people do define it as being DC, but it really, for 40 years, operated out of Baltimore. It was a Baltimore firm. 14 different businesses by the Civil War were operated by Hecht family members all throughout that city before they decided, as Woodward Lothrop did, that it was time to come down in D.C. And they did do it in D.C., just to get the correct date, so I have the right information for you, in 1896. The early business that they had was built on credit. And they knew they were going after a moderate income shopper. And here we go with the Hecht Company in Silver Spring. And I know we could talk about Hecht's. I mean, was it a formidable competitor for many years, and almost sat kind of quietly waiting for the industry to kind of change and evolve before it made its huge mark. But talking about a huge mark, I have all these mementos, by the way, over here, if you ever want to take a look after the talk. But I wanted to bring this up. Hecht Company opened in 1947, and November 1st, 1947, I do have the ribbon cutting before one of the Hecht family members was just going to get rid of it at the clearing out the house up in Baltimore. But the Hecht Company in Silver Spring in 1947 was, they say, the fastest growing area on the East Coast. And this store here, this wonderful Art Deco design store, was the largest department store in 1947, built in the country outside of a downtown area, even though it served a kind of downtown purpose. And the one thing that it didn't have going for it was a little too far from the Beltway. Wheaton was able to attack it a little bit better when it opened up in 1960. It always had it never quite made its mark that it wanted to make, but Hecht Company in Silver Spring it was kind of hand in hand. It was part of Silver Spring's identity. What the Hecht Company did, especially as it partnered in 1958 with the May Company out of St. Louis, was really concentrating on the suburban stores. Here you have Prince George's Plaza, and then you have the store in Tysons, just for example. There's something about Landsbergs. Who liked Landsbergs? Let's do that again. Who liked Landsbergs? Or most of you just kind of... That's what I found fascinating. So I feel like we had some type of alien invasion and they just kind of wiped it away. I would talk to people about Landsbergs. I wanted to know more about Landsbergs. I felt Landsbergs deserved to have some more response than... Because, they supplied the black crepe for Lincoln's funeral. They're the oldest store and opened up down here in 1860. But it just kind of in some ways sat there quietly, not knowing what its role was. It was purchased in 1951 by company City Stores, which was known for operating modest department stores in big cities. Not really the go-getter. The owner of that City Stores was so controversial that when he passed away, people attended the funeral just to make sure he was dead. Because, to elicit what was Landsberg's and talking to people, I couldn't get much out of them. And eventually, being more modest, especially more modest than Hecht Company, it started finding itself competing more with the discount stores than it did with the more traditional department stores. And don't get all passionate on me with department stores and say how much you mourn them when you know you were going to Corvettes and S. Klein as well. You were doing that. You were shopping later at night, buying a little bit of cheaper goods there. We all were. My parents were doing the same. And that just kind of made it harder to compete with many of these stores, whether it be Landsberg's, whether it be, Hecht's, they had the backing. But with Woodward and Lothrop especially, but you expected them to be there. I love that. Shirlington. They didn't even bother to put the full name on it. They just put an L on it. I don't know. You don't even know what Landsberg's is. I hope they knew it in 1951 when it opened. Cans. See, look, I can mention cans and I get more of a but you mentioned Landsberg's. You get a little bit. I don't really know why it was with cans. I don't know. Maybe you can explain it a little better, because when you just look at it and read about it, it doesn't like jump out at you. Yeah, founded in 1893 again, like Landsberg's. Founded in Baltimore before it came here, and known more for that, maybe a little bit more like for the domestics aspect of it. Located there on what they call the busy corner. I love this aluminum facade. Put on in 1959. Didn't last the fire 20 years later, after the store closed in 1973 downtown. But that is to kind of modernize it. Department stores didn't need outside light anymore. They had the nice fluorescent stuff to make the stuff look good. But cans elicits, I'm sorry? I wrote it down just so I wouldn't, it's 8th in Pennsylvania is where? 7th in Pennsylvania? I mean, the way, yeah, I am not gonna fight you. Yes, it closed actually in 1975 downtown, and then had that bad fire in 1979. It only opened one other branch store, and that was out in Arlington. The other store that you know that you're just going to get is Jellif's. Landsberg's, Jellif's, but much more of a woman's store. When the wife really operated that company after he suddenly passed away. I always want to do a book someday on powerful women in retailing, because there were you find these like whether they were just using their husband's name, or the husband passed and they were just in charge. Or just kind of leaders that took in there. I do want to do that and have it be less of a memory book. I'm not an author, I'm an oboist. But I'd love to do a real research thing on revolutionary women in retailing. I think there's a role in there. Okay, I do what I am. You have to tell all about the department store stories, and this is a reality of not just in DC and just in Alabama. You'll find it all around this country, where department stores were not. I usually like to say department stores carried everything for everybody. That wasn't necessarily the truth. I mean, you go down, you don't have to be in the Deep South. You could be in Wilmington, Delaware. With department stores, even Woodward Lothrop, with the separate entrances, the separate drinking fountains, all of that played in there. When you said the affection that you have for elevator operators, those were the jobs that were offered to African Americans, would be custodial and elevator operator, working in there. It took a bigger uprising in order to kind of make some changes. When they were being pressured to integrate Woodies in 1963 down there in downtown, people would come in to check the sales force, and they would pull an African-American worker and put them on the sales force just to make it seem like they were hiring them and working in the sales capacity. It was just it was a struggle to still integrate. When Martin Luther King, that assassination happened, DC wasn't the only place. We know that with every city. Look at Baltimore, look at, Newark even had it in 67, but all the big cities with Detroit and all, growing up near Camden even, that really kind of changed the game for us and for these places. When this happened in April 1963, cherry blossoms were out, and the visitors were in town. And you had 3 days of looting with over 600 businesses destroyed, just businesses. And when the department stores announced, when there were 3 separate demonstrations heading their way downtown, after that happened, the department stores decided to close their doors. When department stores close, everybody gets out of town. They say, I can't believe what the district's worst traffic nightmare was about, because they say that happened that day, because things never usually seem that fun down here in the car. But that really changed the game. Stores dropped in downtown 5 to 15% immediately. And the whole perception of downtowns across the country, and even not just as a place to live or shop, but a place to live. That's the Hecht Company there after that. Here it talks about the retail sales drop. And there's Woody's getting quiet. in the 70s. Its future was many of our futures were in the suburbs. But there still was an allegiance, there still was some hope downtown, but it certainly wasn't the bustle. You see these pictures are from 1970 where you see the buildings in need of a clean, in need of a something there. There's that North building. It was decided that just became this albatross on Woodward and Lothrop's around its neck, even though they were making the Wellesley fudge cake there and held Christmas court there. They really wanted to connect the two buildings for the longest time with a bridge, and you can't do that in D.C. with the limits. You can't have the air rights. And this store was deemed structurally unsafe, this building in 1987. But they still opened, there's Montgomery Mall. Going there and still marching with the suburbs, because that by then Hecht was really getting in control of the suburbs, and Woodward Lothrop was kind of chasing one of the hope. Besides, with here they are at Montgomery Mall. Yeah, that was a good store for them, but it took them 8 years because there was a sewer moratorium when they were building the mall that they were 8 years too late in operating it in order to get it going. They got it going in 1976, in addition to the subway, the long-promised subway. And they had that door there at Metro Center that opened people right into it. That gave a little bit more hope downtown. I mean, I'm going to breeze through some here because, it's hard to talk about all the department stores and have it be done by Christmas. But here, here's Hecht's at 7th and F. The F Street shopping corridor wasn't what it was. And the exact year, I don't know. But I do know in 1985, when they opened that Metro Center store, that really kind of changed the game. That store's still operating now as Macy's. And being able to kind of change their image, that Hecht Company just kind of quietly looking and seizing on the opportunities. At the time, Woodward and Lothrop was really, as you were getting these other places up Wisconsin Avenue and Tysons Corner area and all, it's hard to compete as an independent retailer, which Woodward and Lothrop was. And then as you go through some boardroom battles, especially in 1983, where turf wars with families and other interests and mergers become part of the day, it's really tough on an independent store. Yes, they celebrated their 100th anniversary in 1980. Yes, they took the ampersands out of the name in 1978, so it was Woodward/Lothrop. And you all complained, it's Woodward and Lothrop. They took it out. They took 18 months for them to design. They wanted to get rid of the ampersands, and they took it away, I think, in just a couple weeks because you all were getting upset. You weren't necessarily going there, but Woodward and Lothrop was supposed to be there. They did that beautiful renovation on that main floor in 1986. At that time, the store was in different hands. It was with Taubman, a commercial real estate out of Michigan. And you had a boardroom battle. You had, there was an article in Washington Magazine, what's wrong with Woodies, or what are the ills of Woodies? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. What is it? Yes. And that just exposed everything. It exposed the chaos that was going on there. Chaos. Let's expand. Woodward and Lothrop is getting, let's get bigger. That was the mentality especially in the 80s. To be more competitive, you have to expand. John Wanamaker, that's a huge name, resource, whatever, but it was antiquated for Philadelphia standards, but it's still, everybody expected Wanamakers to always be there. It operates as a Macy's now, still has the organ, has the eagle, don't worry, and they know not to play with that. When Hecht took it over in 1996 and changed it from Wanamakers to Hecht, they changed it back really quickly to another name, but Wanamakers was weak. The owners out of Los Angeles wanted out. So they sold it to Woodward and Lothrop, angering John Wanamaker executive staff and sales support, where the store was eventually downsized into just 5 floors. You can't have 2 weaker retailers become a stronger one. It just becomes a bigger problem. And here's Tysons. Tysons was great, but everybody was looking forward to Nordstrom's. Boy, the media couldn't get enough of Nordstrom coming to town. You still wanted Woody's there, but Woody's, who is still struggling to have enough capital to expand and merchandise properly, when Nordstrom opened at Tysons, they were not even halfway through their renovation in order to spruce up. They said it looked like Beirut when Nordstrom opened. Woodward Lothrop sales dropped 75% during Nordstrom's opening at their most profitable, highest grossing store. So what do you have here? Garfinkel. Let's go over Garfinkel, not L-E. Don't accept that. 1990, after merging with Brooks Brothers and Miller and Rhodes out of Richmond and all, Garfinkel's had to say goodbye in 1990. Woodward and Lothrop limped along, joining bankruptcy in 1994, finally having to face its liquidation and facing into such of a turf battle with May Company, owners of Hecht, and also with JCPenney planning in there, and Federated Department Stores. I always, and I do have things over here, if you want to come by. It was hard when, I think, for Washington to lose Woodward and Lothrop. And you're not allowed to have these things, by the way. Liquidators destroy these. They don't want the company's name to linger on in a bad way, in a negative way. I had to coerce somebody to let me keep this sign as a memory. And when Woody's finally went in August of 1995, they did put this announcement in the Washington Post. The Washington Post that had a wonderful relationship with Woody's. When the Washington Post was hurting and Woody's needed to help it, they did so, and vice versa. So here you have, after 115 years together, we have one final thing to say: thank you. Our historic liquidation sale begins tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. That is not the original goodbye. That was nixed by the May Company. The original goodbye, which a gentleman shared with me because his daughter wrote it, which he took a picture of for Monday, August 21st, 1995. Let me read this for you. This was the original goodbye that was deemed too personal. But I'll read it to you here, once my glasses are off. When you remember Christmas in Washington, or think of your first day at school, when you smell your mother's perfume, or think of Saturdays in the tea room with grandma, or plunk down in your very favorite chair, when you wear your well-worn favorite shirt, or think about your first interview suit, or remember seeing yourself in those huge mirrors in your perfect wedding gown, Woody's will always be here. It's been nice knowing you, and thank you. So I love getting these little things. I mean, I wish I could have had that for the book. But but when you do these books, the stories come out. There you go with Woody's and Chevy Chase. It was sold to Hecht before and operated for a little while. Hecht, which operated to 2006. I love how the building is still out there. It's protected on the exterior downtown. They almost made an opera house out of the middle of it. I don't like the paint, but you can always remove paint. And there we are there. Woodward and Lothrop, a story of the nation's capital, which dates from, I think this is from 1947. I never mean to change the world when I do these books. I am not trying to be the expert that I'm made out to be. I like learning. I like telling stories. I like studying these things, these stores. I did write a book on the 100th anniversary of the Baltimore Symphony. Oh, try writing about your employer. That's hard. And to be very, very honest. And fair. And for those of you that do attend the BSO concerts up at Strathmore, thank you. And I spend a lot of time in the Montgomery County schools, especially many of the Title I schools that are here doing projects right in the elementary schools, doing a lot in Silver Spring and in that general area as well. But it's been a fascinating ride to kind of share these stories, to see the interest. I mean, you can just talk for hours on these places. It can be focused, it can just be a babble. But I remember that it was about the time, for me, it all goes back to the happy thoughts. with the time I was spending with my mother. I don't have that time anymore. But it's still, that's what it was all about. It was that social thing. It wasn't shopping. And I don't think these things will ever be back. That's not the way it's going to work. But I'm glad I'm able to document their stories hopefully as best as I can. And it's great coming down here in Chevy Chase. Thank you very much.